In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a chilling mystery unfolds. A strange tapping echoes through the night, mistaken for a desperate Morse code plea, when reclusive engineer Mr. Crane is found unconscious. A coffee stain spelling help on his parlor rug reveals a violent attack. Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp mind and quiet wisdom, unravels a web of greed and secrets. From a hidden wrench to a stranger's grey coat, every clue points to a battle over a revolutionary invention. Will Miss Marple decode the truth before the attacker strikes again? Dive into a tale of deception, where even a cup of coffee speaks louder than words. The tapping in the night, the late autumn sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, softening the edges of the village's thatched cottages and neat hedgerows. In her modest sitting room at Danemead Cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her fingers deftly working a pair of knitting needles through a skein of pale blue wool. The rhythm of her knitting was as steady as the ticking of the mantel clock, but her mind was alert, attuned to the subtle currents of village life. It was a Thursday, and Thursdays often brought visitors, for it was market day and St. Mary. Mead buzzed with quiet gossip. The door opened with a soft creak, and Mrs. Elspeth Harrow entered. Her face flushed from the crisp air and something more excited perhaps. Mrs. Harrow, a widow who lived in a tidy semi-detached house on Lavender Lane, was not one for theatrics, but her eyes darted nervously as she settled into the chintz armchair Miss Marple offered. "Oh, Miss Marple," she began, clutching her handbag, "I hardly know where to start. It's that house next door, the Grantham place. There's been the strangest noise these past nights." Miss Marple's needles paused, hovering like delicate antennae. "A noise, Mrs. Harrow." Her voice was gentle, encouraging, with that faint note of curiosity that invited confidences. "What sort of noise?" "Tapping," Mrs. Harrow said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, as if the sound might follow her here. "Every night, regular as you please, coming through the wall from Mr. Crane's house. It's not rats, I'm sure of it. It's too precise. Tap, 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 then a pause, then more taps. I've lain awake listening, and it gives me the shivers." Miss Marple tilted her head, her clear blue eyes studying Mrs. Harrow. The Grantham house, a sturdy Victorian relic with ivy-clad walls, had stood empty for years until Mr. Leonard Crane, a reserved gentleman of middle age, took up residence 3 months prior. He kept to himself, a habit that intrigued the village without alarming it until now. "How long has this been going on?" Miss Marple asked, resuming her knitting with a slow, deliberate click. "A week, perhaps 10 days, Mrs. Harrow replied. "I thought at first it might be the wind, or those old pipes in the Grantham house, but it's too rhythmic. Last night, I swear it went on past midnight. I almost knocked on his door, but, well, Mr. Crane's not the sort you disturb, is he?" Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Mr. Crane was an enigma, even by St. Mary Mead's standards. He rarely appeared at the village shop, sent no letters through Mr. Wilson at the post office, and was seen only occasionally, striding to the bus stop with a leather satchel under his arm. A private man, the villagers called him, though Miss Hartnell, never one to mince words, had labelled him downright peculiar. Miss Marple, however, reserved judgment. Privacy, she knew, often masked nothing more sinister than a preference for solitude, but not always. "Have you mentioned this to anyone else?" Miss Marple asked, setting her knitting in her lap, only to young Tommy Pierce, the paper boy. Mrs. Harrow said, "His family lives on the other side of the Grantham house, you know. He said he's heard it too, though he thought Mr. Crane was hammering at something. boys, you know, they don't think much of odd noises. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Tommy Pierce, with his freckled face and boundless curiosity, was not one to let a mystery pass unexamined. She made a mental note to speak with him. And Mr. Crane himself, have you seen him about? Not since last week, Mrs. Harrow admitted. He was in his garden, fiddling with some wires and bits of metal. I called out a good morning, but he only nodded and went inside. I don't think he's fond of company. Miss Marple's mind turned, as it often did, to parallels from her long observation of human nature. She recalled Mrs. Clement's lodger, years ago, who had tapped on his ceiling to signal distress when he'd fallen ill. The sound had been dismissed as a loose floorboard until Miss Marple suggested otherwise. Tapping, she mused aloud, can be a way of speaking when words won't do. I wonder if Mr. Crane is trying to tell us something. Mrs. Harrow shivered. I hope it's not trouble, Miss Marple. I've half a mind to tell Inspector Craddock. Let us not rush to the police just yet, Miss Marple said, her tone soothing but firm. It may be nothing more than an old house settling into its bones. But I shall listen tonight, Mrs. Harrow. My window faces Lavender Lane, and sound carries in these quiet evenings. Mrs. Harrow departed, somewhat reassured, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts. As dusk fell, she drew her shawl about her shoulders and settled by the open window, the air cool and fragrant with late roses. The village was silent, save for the distant bark of a dog and the soft rustle of leaves. Then, faintly, it came: tap, dash, pause, dash, tap, tap. Miss Marple's pencil moved swiftly over a scrap of paper, noting the pattern. She had learned Morse code during the war, a skill she'd found unexpectedly useful in her quiet village life. The taps formed a word, HLP. She sat back, her heart quickening. A coincidence, perhaps, or a cry from the Grantham house, muffled by its thick walls. Miss Marple closed her window and returned to her knitting, but her mind was far from idle. Tomorrow, she resolved, she would pay a visit to Lavender Lane. Something was amiss, and she intended to find out what. Chapter 2. The unconscious guest. The morning sun rose over St. Mary Mead with a deceptive calm, painting the rooftops with a soft pink glow that belied the agitation stirring in the heart of the village. Miss Jane Marple, awakened early by the persistent chirping of a blackbird outside her window, had barely finished her toast and marmalade when the news reached her. It came, as village news often did, through the breathless arrival of her maid, Cherry Baker, who burst into the dining room with wide eyes and a voice pitched high with excitement. "Miss Marple, you'll never believe it," Cherry exclaimed, her apron slightly askew. "It's Mr. Crane, from the Grantham house. Mrs. Gibbs found him this morning, out cold in his parlour, and Dr. Haydock's been called, and the police, too. They say it's something dreadful." Miss Marple set down her teacup with care, her face composed but her mind already racing. The tapping she had heard last night, spelling out help in Morse code, took on a new and ominous significance. "Unconscious, you say?" she asked, her tone calm but probing. "Was there any sign of what happened to him?" Cherry, eager to share every detail, leaned forward. "Mrs. Gibbs said he was lying on the rug near the fireplace with a broken coffee cup beside him. There's a queer smell of coffee in the room," she said, "and a stain on the floor, like he spilled it before he fell. Dr. Haydock thinks he was hit on the head, but there's no telling by what or who. The police are there now, Inspector Craddock himself." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Inspector Craddock, a capable young man from Much Benham, had come to value her insights in past cases, though he sometimes chafed at her unorthodox methods. She rose, smoothing her skirt. I think, Cherry, I shall take a walk to Lavender Lane. Fresh air is good for the mind, and I should like to see this for myself. The Grantham house, a solid structure of red brick with tall, narrow windows, stood at the end of Lavender Lane, its garden overgrown with late-blooming asters and untamed ivy. As Miss Marple approached, she noted the small crowd gathered near, the gate villagers, curious but keeping a respectful distance. Miss Hartnell, her hat slightly askew, was holding court with Mrs. Price from the post office, her voice carrying sharp opinions about Mr. Crane's solitary habits. Mark my words, Miss Hartnell declared, a man who keeps to himself like that is bound to come to a bad end. Miss Marple passed them with a polite nod, her attention fixed on the house. The front door stood ajar, and she glimpsed Inspector Craddock's broad shoulders in the hallway. Conferring with Dr. Haydock, she hesitated only a moment before stepping forward, her small figure unobtrusive yet purposeful. Craddock spotted her at once and, with a mixture of resignation and warmth, beckoned her inside. Miss Marple, he said, his voice tinged with a wry smile. I might have known you'd turn up. Mrs. Gibbs said you'd been asking about noises from this house. A small matter of curiosity, Miss Marple replied, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. But it seems the situation has grown rather more serious. May I see where Mr. Crane was found? Craddock led her into the parlour, a room of faded grandeur with heavy drapes and a high ceiling. The air held a faint, bitter scent of coffee, mingling with the musty odour of old books and polished wood. On the rug near the fireplace lay Mr. Crane, now covered with a blanket, awaiting the ambulance from Much Benham. Dr. Haydock, a brisk man with a nonsense manner, was packing his medical bag. Head trauma, he said, without preamble. A nasty blow to the temple, but he's alive barely. No fractures, but he's in a bad way. We'll know more once he's in hospital. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, taking in every detail with the precision of a painter studying a canvas. The fireplace was cold, its grate filled with ash. A small table held a telegraph key, its wires neatly coiled, suggesting Mr. Crane's interest in communication devices. A bookshelf sagged under the weight of technical manuals, their titles obscured by dust. But it was the rug that drew her attention. A dark, spreading stain marred its intricate pattern, and beside it lay the shards of a porcelain coffee cup, its handle broken clean off. Spilled coffee, Craddock remarked, following her gaze. Odd, isn't it? You'd think a man falling would knock over more than just a cup. The room's tidy, otherwise no signs of a struggle. Miss Marple knelt carefully, her knees protesting, and examined the stain. It was not a random splash, but a series of irregular shapes, as if the coffee had been manipulated before it dried. She adjusted her spectacles and leaned closer, her heart quickening. There, faint but unmistakable, were the letters HLP formed in the dark liquid. Inspector, she said softly, this is no ordinary spill. Mr. Crane wrote something here. I think, before he lost consciousness. Craddock crouched beside her, his brow furrowing. Help, are you sure, Miss Marple? It could just be a trick of the stain. I am quite sure, she replied, her voice firm. I have seen such things before, in my nephew's parish, when a poor woman scrawled a name in chalk as she fainted. People, when desperate, use what is at hand. Mr. Crane had only his coffee, it seems. Dr. Haydock, overhearing, raised an eyebrow. A message in coffee. That's a new one. But if he was clutching the cup when Mrs. Gibbs found him, must have been drinking it just before he was struck. Miss Marple stood, brushing her hands together. Struck, you say? Have you found what might have caused the injury? Not yet, Craddock admitted. We're searching the house, but it's a big place, and Crane's things are a jumble: tools, wires, all sorts of gadgets in the basement. He's an engineer, they say, always tinkering. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the tapping she had heard the previous night. The Morse code had spelled help, just as the coffee did now. But if Mr. Crane was unconscious, who had been tapping? Or had the sound been something else entirely, misinterpreted by her own eager imagination? She recalled the old vicarage, where a creaking gate had once been mistaken for footsteps, leading to all manner of confusion. "Inspector," she said, "might I look around a bit more? Sometimes the smallest things tell the largest stories." Craddock hesitated, then nodded. "Just don't touch anything, Miss Marple. This is a crime scene now." The parlour yielded little more at first glance. A single armchair, its upholstery worn, faced the window, suggesting Mr. Crane spent evenings there, perhaps reading or working. A small desk held a notebook, its pages filled with diagrams of circuits and cryptic notations. Miss Marple, careful not to disturb it, noted a reference to a signal amplifier, a term unfamiliar but suggestive of Mr. Crane's solitary pursuits. She moved to the fireplace, where a faint draught stirred the ashes, and then to the telegraph key, which seemed out of place in a domestic setting. Its presence confirmed her suspicion that Mr. Crane was no ordinary recluse. He had a purpose, one tied to communication. As she explored, Mrs. Gibbs, the housekeeper, entered, her face pale, and her hands twisting a handkerchief. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling, "I never thought to see such a thing. I came in at 8, as always, and there he was, lying so still I thought he was dead. I screamed and ran for Dr. Haydock." "You did right, Mrs. Gibbs," Miss Marple said kindly. "Did you notice anything unusual when you arrived? The door, perhaps, or any sounds?" Mrs. Gibbs shook her head. "The door was locked, as it always is. Mr. Crane's particular about that. I used my key. There was no sound, except, well, that tapping I've heard before, through the walls. I thought it was him working, but now—" She trailed off, her eyes darting to the rug. Miss Marple's thoughts quickened. The tapping again, yet Mr. Crane could not have been its source this morning. "Mrs. Gibbs," she asked, "did you smell the coffee when you entered, or only later?" "Only when I knelt beside him," Mrs. Gibbs replied. "It was strong, like he'd just poured it. The cup was still warm to the touch." This detail struck Miss Marple as significant. A warm cup suggested the incident was recent, perhaps occurring just before Mrs. Gibbs's arrival. Yet the house was locked, with no signs of forced entry. She filed this away, her mind turning to the villagers who might have had access. Mrs. Gibbs, with her key, was an obvious candidate, but her distress seemed genuine. There was also young Tommy Pierce, who lived next door and had admitted to hearing the tapping. And Miss Hartnell, always poking her nose where it wasn't wanted, had been seen near the Grantham house yesterday. According to Mrs. Price, Craddock interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Marple, we've found something in the basement, a heavy wrench tucked behind some pipes. It's got a speck of something that might be blood. We're sending it for analysis." "A wrench," Miss Marple murmured. "Yes, that would do it. But we must be careful, Inspector. A wrench is a common thing in a house like this, and Mr. Crane was a tinkerer. The blood may tell us more, but not everything. She returned to the rug, her eyes lingering on the coffee stain. The letters HLP were fainter now as the liquid dried, but their message was clear. Mr. Crane had known he was in danger, had used his last moments of clarity to leave a plea. But for whom? And why had he not cried out or reached for the telephone, which stood on a table across the room? Miss Marple recalled a case in St. Mary Mead years ago, when a young man, poisoned, had scrawled a name in ink on his blotting paper. The act had seemed futile at the time, yet it had led to the culprit's capture. People, she thought, are remarkably resilient, even in their final moments. She turned to Craddock. "Inspector, I think we should speak to the neighbours." Again Mrs. Harrow and young Tommy Pierce, in particular. They heard the tapping, and they may have seen something last night. And perhaps Mr. Wilson at the post office, he might know if Mr. Crane received any visitors or letters that could shed light on this. Craddock nodded, accustomed to her suggestions, though he still marvelled at her ability to see connections where others saw only chaos. "I'll have my men canvass the lane," he said. "But what's this about tapping? Mrs. Harrow mentioned it to you, didn't she?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but deliberate. "And I heard it myself last night, through my window. It was Morse code, Inspector, spelling help, just as the coffee does here. But I wonder now if the tapping was not Mr. Crane at all. It was too regular, too mechanical. I have a notion it might be something in the house itself, pipes, perhaps, or a radiator. Mr. Pye, the plumber, could tell us." Craddock's eyebrows rose. "Morse code, you're sure?" "As sure as I am of my own name," Miss Marple said, with a small smile. "I learned it during the war, you know. It's not a skill one forgets." She stepped back, allowing Craddock to direct his men, who were now photographing the scene and dusting for fingerprints. The parlour, with its heavy furniture and quiet secrets, seemed to close in around her, whispering of things left unsaid. Miss Marple's mind turned to Mr. Crane's solitary life, his technical pursuits, and the faint possibility that his work had drawn danger to him. She thought of the telegraph key, the diagrams, the letters in his notebook. Had someone wanted his invention, or feared it? And why the coffee, of all things, to leave a message? As the ambulance arrived and Mr. Crane was carefully lifted onto a stretcher, Miss Marple stood by the window, her eyes scanning Lavender Lane. The villagers had dispersed, but their whispers lingered, a chorus of suspicion and curiosity. She knew, from long experience, that the truth lay not in the obvious, but in the overlooked, the small, human details that people like Inspector Craddock, for all his diligence, might miss. A message in coffee, she murmured to herself, and a tapping that speaks without a voice. "We shall see, Mr. Crane, we shall see." She turned to leave, her step light but purposeful. The Grantham house held its secrets tightly, but Miss Marple was patient. She would unravel them, thread by thread, as she always did. Chapter 3. The Neighbours' Tales. The morning mist hung low over St. Mary Mead, curling around the hedgerows and softening the outlines of the cottages along Lavender Lane. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, stepped out of Dane Mead Cottage with a purposeful air, her small black notebook tucked into her handbag. The events at the Grantham house had stirred the village into a quiet frenzy, and she knew that the truth, like the mist, would be found in the delicate spaces between what was said and what was left unsaid. Her first task was to speak with those closest to the signed Mrs. Elspeth Harrow, young Tommy Pierce, and, if her instincts proved correct, the ever-vigilant Miss Hartnell. Each, she suspected, held a fragment of the puzzle that was Mr. Crane's. Misfortune, she began with Mrs. Harrow, whose semi-detached house shared a wall with the Grantham residence. The widow was in her garden, fussing over a bed of late chrysanthemums, her hands trembling slightly as she clipped a wilted bloom. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, looking up with a start, "I haven't slept a wink since yesterday. That poor Mr. Crane, lying there all helpless, it's dreadful to think of it happening right next door." Miss Marple settled onto a garden bench, her expression one of gentle concern. "It is most unsettling, Mrs. Harrow. You mentioned the tapping last night, and I wonder if you might tell me more. Every detail, however small, could be important." Mrs. Harrow set down her shears, her face creasing with worry. "It's been every night this past week, as I told you. Always after 10, when the village goes quiet. Tap, 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 then a pause, then more taps, like someone sending a signal. I thought at first it was Mr. Crane working on one of his contraptions. He's always down in that basement of his. You know, but now, with him hurt," she shuddered, "it's as if the house itself is crying out." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the Morse code she had deciphered. "Did you hear it again last night, after Mr. Crane was taken to hospital?" Mrs. Harrow hesitated, her eyes darting to the wall that separated her home from the Grantham house. I believe I did, though I was so shaken I might have imagined it. It was fainter perhaps, but the same rhythm, ... or some such. I'm no expert, but it felt the same." This detail struck Miss Marple as significant. If the tapping had continued after Mr. Crane's collapse, it could not have been him sending the signalant. Of course, he had left some device running, a possibility she filed away for later. "And have you seen anyone near the Grantham house recently?" she asked. "Visitors, perhaps, or anyone lingering?" Mrs. Harrow shook her head. "Mr. Crane keeps to himself. The only person I've seen regular like is Mrs. Gibbs, going in to clean, and young Tommy Pierce, delivering the papers. Oh, and Miss Hartnell was by the other day, poking about. She said she was checking on the lane's hedges, but you know how she is always looking for something to talk about." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Miss Hartnell's curiosity was as predictable as the church clock, and just as loud. "Thank you, Mrs. Harrow," she said, rising. "You've been most helpful. Do try to rest. You've had quite a shock." Her next stop was the Pierce household, a cheerful cottage on the other side of the Grantham house, where roses climbed the trellis and a bicycle lay propped against the fence. Tommy Pierce, a lanky boy of 14 with a mop of sandy hair, was polishing his bicycle in the front garden when Miss Marple approached. He looked up, his freckled face breaking into a grin. "Morning, Miss Marple. Heard about Mr. Crane? I suppose everyone's talking about it." "Indeed, Tommy," Miss Marple said, settling onto a low wall to ease her knees. "I understand you've heard the tapping from Mr. Crane's house. Could you tell me about it?" Tommy wiped his hands on a rag, his expression turning thoughtful. "Yeah, I heard it, all right. Started about a week ago, maybe more. At first I thought it was him banging on something, nails or pipes, you know. He's always messing about in that basement. Got all sorts of tools and wires down there. I sneaked a peek once, through the window, when he wasn't looking." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly, though her tone remained mild. "Did you? Now, and what did you see?" Tommy grinned, unabashed. "Heaps of stuff boxes with blinking lights, coils of wire, and a funny machine with a lever, like something from a wireless set." I reckon he's building something secret. Maybe that's why someone bashed him wanted to steal it. Miss Marple's mind quickened at the mention of the machine. A wireless set, or something akin to it, could explain the Morse code, though not the coffee message on the parlor rug. And the tapping. Tommy, did you hear it last night, after Mr. Crane was found? Tommy nodded, kicking a pebble. Sure did. Same as always. Tap, 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 pause, then more. I was out late, fixing my bike chain, and I heard it clear as day. Thought it was odd, with Mr. Crane gone and all. This confirmed Mrs. Harrow's account, deepening the mystery. The tapping was not Mr. Crane's doing, then, but something else, a mechanical quirk, perhaps, or a deliberate misdirection. Miss Marple leaned forward. Have you seen anyone else near the house, Tommy? Anyone who didn't belong? Tommy shrugged. Just the usual Mrs. Gibbs, the postman, and that lady from the London company who came last week. She was asking Mr. Crane about some gadget, but he sent her packing. I heard him say he wasn't selling, not for any price. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. A visitor from London, interested in Mr. Crane's work, was a new thread to follow. Thank you, Tommy, she said, slipping him a shilling for his candor. You've a sharp eye, and that's a rare thing. Her final call was to Miss Hartnell, whose cottage at the end of the lane was a hub of village gossip. Miss Hartnell, a stout woman with a penchant for loud hats and louder opinions, was in her parlor, sorting through a pile of parish magazines. Miss Marple, she exclaimed, waving her in. I knew you'd be about, sniffing out trouble. That Grantham House business is a scandal, isn't it? A man like Mr. Crane, living like a hermit bound to come to no good. Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting needles emerging from her bag as if by instinct. It is most distressing, she agreed. I understand you were near the Grantham House recently. Did you notice anything unusual? Miss Hartnell's eyes gleamed with the thrill of being consulted. I was there 2 days ago, checking the lane for overgrown hedges. It's my duty. As chair of the Women's Institute, you know. I saw Mr. Crane in his garden, tinkering with some metal contraption. Looked like a wireless aerial, if you ask me. I called out, but he barely glanced uproot, I thought. And then, yesterday afternoon, I saw a stranger, a man in a grey coat, walking past the house. He lingered by the gate, looking shifty. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, betraying none of the excitement she felt. A stranger in a grey coat was a detail worth pursuing, especially in a village where newcomers stood out like a crow in a snowstorm. Did you recognize him? Miss Hartnell, no, but he wasn't local, Miss Hartnell said firmly. Too well dressed for St. Mary Mead, with a city air about him. I'd have spoken to him, but he hurried off when he saw me watching. Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving together the threads of these accounts. Mrs. Harrow's fear, Tommy's curiosity, and Miss Hartnell's suspicions painted a picture of a village on edge, circling a mystery centered on the Grantham House. The tapping, persistent and rhythmic, suggested something mechanical. Yet the coffee message LP, scrawled in desperation, pointed to a human hand. And now, a stranger and a London visitor added new layers to the puzzle. She recalled a case from years past, when a series of odd noises in the vicarage had turned out to be a loose shutter, mistaken for a prowler's footsteps. Could the tapping be similarly innocent, a radiator or pipe playing tricks on eager ears? Yet the coffee message was no trick, nor was the blow that felled Mr. Crane. Someone had entered that locked house, struck him, and left him to be found. The question was not only who, but why. As she rose to leave, Miss Hartnell pressed a cup. of tea into her hands. "You'll get to the bottom of this, Miss Marple," she said with a mix of admiration and envy. "You always do." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes distant. "I hope so, Miss Hartnell. It's the small things. You know, the things we overlook that often tell the truth." She stepped back into the lane, the mist now lifting to reveal a clear, crisp day. Her thoughts turned to Mr. Crane's basement, with its wires and machines, and to the stranger in the grey coat. She would need to speak to Mr. Wilson at the post office, who might know of any letters or visitors linked to Mr. Crane's work. And she must revisit the Grantham house to see if the parlour held further secrets. The coffee stain, she felt certain, was the key, a silent cry from a man who knew he was in danger. As she walked home, her steps slow but steady, Miss Marple's mind was alive with possibilities. She thought of her nephew Raymond's stories, how he laughed at her village parallels, yet how often they proved true. People, she knew, were much the same everywhere, driven by greed, fear, or desperation. Mr. Crane's solitary life, his strange devices, and the tapping that echoed through the night were pieces of a pattern, and she would find how they fit. The church clock struck noon, its chimes carrying over the rooftops. Miss Marple paused, her eyes scanning the quiet lane. Somewhere, in the ordinary rhythms of St. Mary Mead, a truth was waiting to be uncovered. She would find it, as she always did, by listening to the tales of those who lived closest to the mystery. Chapter 4. The Grantham House. The afternoon light filtered through the elms of St. Mary Mead, casting dappled shadows across the cobbled path to the Grantham house. Miss Jane Marple, her black handbag clasped firmly, walked with a measured step toward the imposing Victorian structure at the end of Lavender Lane. The house, with its red brick facade and ivy-clad gables, seemed to stand apart from the village, as if guarding secrets within its thick walls. Inspector Craddock had granted her permission to visit the scene, a concession born of respect for her uncanny knack for noticing what others overlooked. Miss Marple, for her part, intended to examine the parlour and its curious coffee stain, but her mind was equally drawn to the house itself, silent witness to Mr. Crane's misfortune as she approached. The front gate creaked under her touch, its hinges rusted from years of neglect. The garden was a tangle of late-season weeds, though a patch near the side of the house showed signs of recent disturbance, perhaps where Mr. Crane had been working. As Miss Hartnell had observed, Miss Marple paused, her sharp eyes noting a faint trail of flattened grass leading to a basement window. She made a mental note to mention it to Craddock. It might mean nothing, but in her experience, nothing was ever quite as it seemed. Inside, the Grantham house was cool and dim, its air heavy with the scent of old wood and wax polish. A constable stood guard at the parlour door, but he stepped aside with a nod at Craddock's orders. Miss Marple entered, her gaze sweeping the room with the precision of a seamstress measuring cloth. The parlour was much as she had seen it that morning, the fireplace cold, the telegraph key on its small table, the bookshelf sagging under technical volumes. But her attention fixed on the rug, where the coffee stain, now dry and faintly crusted, formed the ghostly letters HELP. She knelt, her knees protesting only slightly, and traced the edges of the stain with a gloved finger. The letters were uneven, scrawled in haste, yet deliberate. "Poor Mr. Crane," she murmured. "You knew you were in danger, didn't you?" Rising, she turned to the telegraph key, its brass gleaming faintly in the afternoon light. It was an old model, the kind used in telegraph offices decades ago, its wires neatly coiled but disconnected. She recalled Tommy Pierce's description of Mr. Crane's basement, filled with wires and blinking lights. Could this key be part of his work, a device for sending signals? And if so, why was it here, in the parlour, rather than in his workshop below? Miss Marple's mind flickered to a long-ago incident in St. Mary Mead, when a retired colonel had used a similar key to send prank messages to his neighbours, causing no end of confusion. But Mr. Crane's message was no prank, it was a plea. She moved the bookshelf, her fingers brushing the spines of books on telegraphy and electrical engineering. One volume, its cover worn, caught her eye. Principles of Signal Amplification. Inside, a page was marked with a folded sheet of paper. Diagram, hand-drawn, showing a complex circuit labelled Morse Enhancer. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Mr. Crane, it seemed, was no mere tinkerer but an inventor, perhaps working on something valuable enough to attract trouble. She slipped the diagram into her handbag, intending to show it to Craddock later. It was not theft, she reasoned, but preservation. Such papers had a way of disappearing in a busy investigation. The parlour yielded little else, so Miss Marple requested to see the basement where Tommy had glimpsed Mr. Crane's workshop. The constable hesitated, but a quick call to Craddock secured her access. The basement stairs were steep and narrow, the air growing colder as she descended. At the bottom, a heavy door opened into a cavernous room lit by a single bulb, its walls lined with shelves of tools, coils of wire, and boxes of electronic components. A workbench dominated the space, cluttered with pliers, soldering irons, and a half-assembled device that resembled the diagram she had found. Nearby, a dusty Morse code chart hung on the wall, its edges curled with age. Miss Marple studied it, confirming what she already knew, the tapping she had heard, and which Mrs. Harrow and Tommy reported, matched the pattern for help. Dot, 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 dot. Dot, 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 dash. But the basement held another clue. Near the workbench, a radiator pipe ran along the wall, its surface pitted with rust. Miss Marple tapped it lightly with her umbrella, producing a faint clang that echoed in the quiet. She recalled Mr. Pye's words about the Grantham house's temperamental heating system. Could this pipe, or one like it, be the source of the tapping? She moved to the corner, where the pipe disappeared into the wall, and noticed a small puddle of water beneath it. A leak, perhaps, or condensation from a faulty valve. She made another mental note. Mr. Pye would need to inspect this. As she explored, her eyes caught a glint of metal behind a crater screwdriver, its handle worn but clean, unlike the dusty sprittings. She left it untouched, knowing Craddock's men would need to examine it, but its placement struck her as odd. Why hide a tool in a workshop full of them? It reminded her of a case years ago, when a gardener's trowel, tucked beneath a rosebush, had been the key to a burglary. Small things, she knew, often carried great weight. Returning upstairs, Miss Marple lingered in the hallway, where a narrow window overlooked the garden. The flattened grass she had noticed earlier was visible from here, leading to the basement. Window. She peered closer, noting a faint smudge on the sill grease perhaps, or dirt from a shoe. It was too faint for certainty, but it suggested someone had been there, perhaps watching or entering. She would tell Craddock to dust the sill. For Prince, though she suspected the intruder, if there was one, had been careful. Back in the parlour, she sat in the worn armchair by the window, letting the room speak to her. The Grantham house was old, its walls thick enough to muffle sound, Yet the tapping had carried to Mrs. Harrow's home and Tommy's. The radiator was a likely culprit, its rhythmic clanging mistaken for Morse code by anxious ears. But the coffee stain was another matter. Mr. Crane, struck down, had used his last strength to write help in the spilled liquid. Why not call out or crawl to the telephone? Miss Marple closed her eyes, picturing the scene. A man alone, a cup in hand, an unexpected blow. The cup falls, coffee spills, and in his fading moments he forms the letters. Knowing they might be his only voice, she thought of Mr. Crane's solitary life, his engineering work, the diagram in her handbag, the London visitor Tommy mentioned, and the stranger in the grey coat Miss Hartnell saw, pointed to an outside interest in Mr. Crane's invention. Had someone come to steal it, or to silence him? The wrench Craddock found, with its possible trace of blood, suggested violence. But the locked door and lack of forced entry puzzled her. Mrs. Gibbs had a key, but her distress seemed genuine. Tommy, curious as he was unlikely to wield a wrench in anger. And Miss Hartnell, for all her nosiness, was more likely to scold than strike. Miss Marple rose, her mind turning to the village's rhythm. St. Mary Mead was a place of days, church services, the daily rounds of the postman. Yet Mr. Crane had disrupted that rhythm, bringing his machines and his secrets. She recalled a young woman in the village, years ago, who had hidden love letters in a sewing box, thinking them safe until a jealous rival found them. Secrets, Miss Marple knew, had a way of drawing danger. She stepped outside, nodding to the constable as she passed. The garden was quiet now, the villagers having dispersed, but she felt their eyes from behind curtains. At the gate, she paused, her gaze lingering on the basement window. The smudge on the sill, the flattened grass, the screwdriver in the basement hall, were threads in a tapestry she was beginning to weave. She would speak to Mr. Wilson at the post office, to learn of any letters or visitors linked to Mr. Crane's work, and she would ask Mr. Pye to inspect the radiator, to confirm her suspicion about the tapping dot. As she walked back to Danemead Cottage, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across Lavender Lane. Miss Marple's thoughts were calm but relentless, sorting through the clues like stitches in a pattern. The Grantham house, with its machines and messages, held the key to Mr. Crane's fate. She would return, she knew, for the house had more to tell, perhaps in the creak of a pipe or the faint trace of a stranger's hand. Chapter 5. The radiator's rhythm. The twilight draped St. Mary Mead in a soft, violet haze, the kind that made the village seem both timeless and secretive. Miss Jane Marple sat by her open window at Danemead Cottage, her knitting needles idle. In her lap, as she listened to the evening's sounds, the distant call of a cuckoo, the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze, and, faintly but unmistakably, the rhythmic tapping from the direction of the Grantham house. Dot, dot, dash, pause, dash, dot, dot. The pattern was unchanged, spelling help in Morse code, just as it had the previous nights. Yet Mr. Crane lay unconscious in March Benham's hospital, his condition still grave, and the house stood empty under police watch. Miss Marple's brow furrowed slightly. The tapping, she felt certain, held a clue, but its persistence suggested it was not the work of human hands. She rose, wrapping her shawl about her shoulders, and resolved to test her growing suspicion. The Grantham house's old radiators, mentioned by Mr. Pye, the village plumber, were a likely source of the noise. In her own cottage, the heating system occasionally clattered in a way that could be mistaken for deliberate signals, especially to an ear primed for mystery. She recalled a winter evening years ago when her neighbor, Mrs. Clement, had sworn she heard footsteps in her attic, only for it to be a loose pipe banging in the wind. Miss Marple's mind, sharp as ever, turned to the possibility that the Grantham house's pipes were playing a similar trick, their mechanical rhythm masquerading as a cry for help. The next morning, after a frugal breakfast of tea and toast, Miss Marple set out to consult Mr. Pye. His shop, a cluttered haven of copper fittings and wrenches at the edge of the village, smelled of oil and metal. Mr. Pye, a wiry man with a face like weathered oak, was polishing a brass valve when she entered. "Miss Marple," he greeted, wiping his hands on a rag, "I heard you've been poking about the Grantham business. Terrible thing, poor Mr. Crane." "Indeed, Mr. Pye," she replied, settling onto a stool he offered. "I'm particularly interested in the house's heating system. Mrs. Harrow and young Tommy Pierce have heard tapping through the walls, and I wonder if the radiators might be the cause. You mentioned they were temperamental." Mr. Pye nodded, his eyes brightening at the chance to discuss his trade. "Oh, aye, those radiators are a proper nuisance. The Grantham house has an old boiler installed back when my father was a lad. The pipes get air trapped in M, and when the heat comes on, they bang like a drum tap, 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 regular as you please. I've been called there twice since Mr. Crane moved in to bleed the system. Never fixed it proper, though. Needs a full overhaul, and that's costly." Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle but probing. "Could such a noise sound like Morse code, Mr. Pye? A pattern, perhaps, repeating at night?" He scratched his chin, considering. "Well, now you mention it, I suppose it could. The pipes don't bang random like. They've got a rhythm when the pressure's up. Dot, dot, dash, you say. That's not impossible. I'd need to check the system to be sure, but I'd wager that's your tapping." This confirmed her hypothesis, but Miss Marple pressed further. "When did you last visit the Grantham house, Mr. Pye? And did you notice anything unusual perhaps in the basement where Mr. Crane kept his tools?" Mr. Pye frowned, his memory straining. "Must have been a month back. Mr. Crane was there, working on some contraption wires and boxes. Looked like a wireless set. I fixed a leak in the radiator down there, but I didn't poke about. He was particular about his space, kept it locked when he wasn't in it. Nothing odd, save for the mestles, everywhere, and a funny smell, like burnt metal." Miss Marple nodded, filing away the detail of the locked basement. "Would you be so kind as to inspect the radiators again, Mr. Pye? Inspector Craddock might allow it, and I'd be grateful to know if the tapping is indeed the pipes." Mr. Pye agreed, promising to visit the Grantham house that afternoon. Miss Marple thanked him and stepped back into the village, her mind buzzing. The radiator's rhythm, if it was the source, explained the tapping, but not the coffee stain in the parlour. Mr. Crane's desperate message, LP scrawled in spilled coffees, suggested an attack, sudden and violent. The wrench Craddock had found, with its possible trace of blood, pointed to a deliberate act. Yet the locked door and lack of forced entry gnawed at her. Someone had entered the house, struck Mr. Crane, and left without a trace, lest the smudge on the basement windowsill, or the flattened grass outside, held the answer. She decided to revisit the Grantham house, hoping to see it in the daylight, with fewer distractions. Inspector Craddock, reached by telephone, granted her access, though his tone carried a hint of amusement. "You're like a terrier, Miss Marple," he said. "Just don't disturb my men there, still combing. The place for prints. The Grantham house, bathed in the morning sun, seemed less foreboding than the previous day, yet its silence was heavy, as if it resented intrusion. The constable at the door nodded her through, and she entered the parlour, where the coffee stain remained, now a faint shadow on the rug. She studied it again, noting how the letters, though blurred, were formed with care, as if Mr. Crane had fought to make them legible. The broken coffee cup lay nearby, its pieces collected in a police evidence bag. She pictured the scene, Mr. Crane, perhaps startled by an intruder, dropping the cup as he was struck, then using the spilled liquid to leave his message. It was an act of remarkable presence of mind, she thought, recalling a widow in St. Mary Mead who had hidden a stolen brooch in her teapot before collapsing from fright. Moving to the basement, Miss Marple descended the narrow stairs with care, her umbrella tapping lightly on each step. The workshop was as she had seen it, cluttered with tools, wires, and the half-assembled device Tommy had described. The Morse code chart still hung on the wall, its presence a reminder of Mr. Crane's expertise. She examined the radiator pipe, its surface cold now, and tapped it again, producing a dull clang. It was plausible, she thought, that this pipe, or one like it, could mimic Morse code when heated. But the screwdriver she had noticed yesterday, tucked behind a crate, was gone, likely taken by Craddock's men for analysis. Its placement still troubled her. In a workshop full of tools, why hide one? She returned upstairs, her thoughts turning to Mr. Crane's invention. The diagram she had found, labelled Morse Enhancer, suggested a device to amplify signals, perhaps for long-distance communication. Such a device could be valuable, especially to a company or individual seeking an edge in the burgeoning field of electronics. The London visitor Tommy mentioned, and the stranger in the grey coat Miss Hartnell saw, pointed to external interest. Had someone come to steal the plans, or to ensure they never reached the market? Miss Marple's mind flickered to a case in her youth when a local inventor's patent for a new loom had been stolen, leading to a cascade of betrayals. Greed, she knew, was a powerful motive. As she stood in the hallway, her eyes fell on a small table by the front door, where a pile of unopened letters lay. With the constable's permission, she glanced through them. Bills, mostly, but one envelope bore a London postmark and the logo of a firm called Barlow and Sons, electrical suppliers. The name struck a chord. Tommy had mentioned a woman from a London company, but could this be related? She made a note to ask Mr. Wilson at the post office, who would know of any regular correspondence. Outside, she met Mr. Pye, who arrived with his toolbox slung over his shoulder. "Right, Miss Marple," he said. "Let's have a look at that radiator. If it's banging like you say, I'll find the culprit." They descended to the basement together, the constable trailing behind. Mr. Pye examined the radiator, tapping its valves and listening to the pipes. "Here's your problem," he said after a moment, pointing to a loose joint. "When the boiler fires up, this shakes and bangs against the wall. Sounds like a code, all right, ... just as you said. I'll tighten it, but it'll need proper fixing soon." Miss Marple watched, satisfied but not surprised. The radiator explained the tapping, but it deepened the mystery of the coffee message. If the tapping was mechanical, Mr. Crane had not been signalling for help through the walls. Yet he had written help in the parlour, suggesting he knew his attacker or, at least, the danger he faced. The locked door, the smudge on the windowsill, the hidden screwdriver all pointed to an intruder who knew the house, or had planned their entry carefully as Mr. Pye worked. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the village, Mrs. Gibbs, with her key, was a natural suspect, but her fear seemed genuine. Tommy Pierce, curious and bold, might have seen more than he admitted. Miss Hartnell's stranger in the grey coat was a tantalizing clue, but vague. And the London letter hinted at a motive tied to Mr. Crane's work. She recalled a village scandal years ago, when a farmer's new plough design had drawn city speculators, one of whom had tried to bribe him. Mr. Crane's invention, she suspected, was at the heart of this affair. She thanked Mr. Pye and stepped back into the garden, where the air was crisp with the scent of autumn leaves. The Grantham house loomed behind her, its windows dark and unyielding. Miss Marple felt a quiet certainty that the truth lay within its walls, not in the grand gestures of a crime, but in the small overlooked details, a smudge, a letter, a pipe's rhythm. She would speak to Mr. Wilson next, and perhaps revisit Mrs. Gibbs, whose nervousness might hide more than fear. As she walked back to the village, her step light but resolute, Miss Marple's mind wove the threads of the mystery, knowing that the pattern, though complex, would soon come clear. Chapter 6. The reclusive Mr. Crane. The morning air in St. Mary Mead carried a sharp bite, the kind that heralded the approach of winter, though the sun still broke through the clouds to warm the cobblestones of Lavender Lane. Miss Jane Marple, her black wool coat buttoned against the chill, walked with a steady purpose toward the village post office, her mind occupied with the enigma of Mr. Leonard Crane. The confirmation that the Grantham house's radiator was the source of the mysterious tapping had shifted the puzzle, but it had not solved it. The coffee stain in the parlour, spelling "help" in Mr. Crane's desperate hand, remained the heart of the matter, a silent cry that pointed to an attack, deliberate and calculated. To understand why, Miss Marple knew she must uncover more about the man himself, a recluse whose solitary life had drawn danger to his door. The post office, a small stone building with a cheery red door, was presided over by Mr. Wilson, a man whose memory for letters and parcels rivaled Miss Marple's own for village gossip. As she entered, the bell above the door jingled, and Mr. Wilson looked up from sorting a stack of envelopes. "Miss Marple," he greeted, his round face creasing into a smile. "I heard you've been about the Grantham business. Poor Mr. Crane's shock him being struck down like that." "Indeed, Mr. Wilson," Miss Marple replied, settling onto a stool by the counter. "I'm trying to understand Mr. Crane a little better. He seems a private man. But I wonder if you might have noticed anything about his correspondence letters, perhaps, or visitors who called for him." Mr. Wilson adjusted his spectacles, his expression turning thoughtful. "Private's the word for him, all right. Never one for chit-chat, Mr. Crane. He got letters regular like, though mostly from London, technical ones, full of diagrams and numbers. I couldn't make head nor tail of M, but they came from a firm called Barlow and Sons, and another called Meridian Tech. He'd collect M himself, never had M delivered, and always paid his postage prompt." Miss Marple's interest sharpened at the mention of Barlow and Sons, the name on the envelope she had seen in the Grantham house. "Did these letters seem urgent, Mr. Wilson? Or perhaps there was a change in their frequency?" "Well, now you mention it," Mr. Wilson said, scratching his chin. "There were more in the last month, 3 or 4 a week, some marked confidential, and a woman came by last week, asking if Mr. Crane had received a parcel. Said she was from Meridian Tech, checking on a delivery. I told her nothing had come, and she looked proper put out. Left in a huff, she did." This aligned with Tommy Pierce's account of a London visitor, and Miss Marple made a mental note to pursue it further. And visitors, Mr. Wilson. Did anyone else call for Mr. Crane? Not many, he replied. There was a man last week, though, in a grey coat, city type. Asked for directions to the Grantham house, but didn't give his name. I saw him later, walking past the church, looking like he didn't want to be noticed. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Miss Stranger in the grey coat was no longer a vague shadow, but a figure worth tracing. Thank you, Mr. Wilson, she said, slipping him a small smile. You've been most helpful. If anything else comes to mind, do let me know. As she left the post office, her thoughts turned to Mr. Crane's past. A retired engineer, widowed and childless, he had come to St. Mary Mead to escape the clamour of the city, so the village assumed. But his letters and his basement workshop suggested a man still engaged in his craft, perhaps driven by ambition or necessity. The Morse enhancer diagram she had found hinted at an invention of some value, and the interest from London firms pointed to a motive. Miss Marple recalled a case from her youth, when a local chemist's formula for a new tonic had drawn unscrupulous buyers, one of whom had resorted to threats. Could Mr. Crane's work have attracted a similar predator? Her next stop was the hospital in Much Benham, where Mr. Crane lay recovering. Inspector Craddock had arranged for her to visit. Sensing that her gentle questions might elicit details his own interrogations could not. The hospital, a modern building of white brick, smelled of antiseptic and starched linens. Mr. Crane's room was small but bright, its window overlooking a garden where patients strolled. He lay propped on pillows, his face pale and his temple bandaged, but his eyes were alert, following Miss Marple as she entered. Mr. Crane, she said softly, taking a seat beside his bed. I'm Jane Marple, from St. Mary Mead. I'm so sorry for what's happened. May I ask you a few questions? It might help us understand who did this to you. Mr. Crane nodded weakly, his voice a hoarse whisper. I don't remember much. It was dark in the parlour. I was working, heard a noise behind me, then pain and nothing. Miss Marple's expression was one of quiet sympathy. You were working on your invention, perhaps, the Morse enhancer. His eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise. You know about that? Yes, I was testing it. A device to boost Morse signals make clear over long distances. I've been at it for years. Companies want it, but I wouldn't sell. Not yet. This confirmed her suspicions, but she pressed gently. Did anyone visit you recently, Mr. Crane? Someone from London, perhaps, or a stranger in the village? He frowned, his fingers clutching the blanket. There was a woman from Meridian. Tech wanted to buy the plans, offered a good sum. I said no, and a man came the day before. Grey coat, didn't give his name. Said he was an engineer, wanted to collaborate. I sent him away, didn't trust him. Miss Marple's mind quickened. The man in the grey coat again, and the woman from Meridian Tech, and the coffee, Mr. Crane, she said, her voice soft but firm. You spilled it and wrote help on the rug. Do you recall doing that? His face clouded, as if the memory were just out of reach. I think so. I was falling, the cup in my hand. I knew I was hurt, wanted to leave a sign. The coffee was there, so I trailed off, his strength fading. Miss Marple patted his hand gently. You did well, Mr. Crane. Rest now. We'll find who did this. As she left the hospital, her thoughts were a tapestry of clues. Mr. Crane's invention was the key. She felt certain a device valuable, enough to draw interest from London, and perhaps dangerous enough to provoke violence. The man in the grey coat, the woman from Meridian Tech, and the letters from Barlow and Sons suggested a web of ambition and greed. But the locked door of the Grantham house troubled her. Mrs. Gibbs had a key, but her fear seemed genuine. Tommy Pierce, for all his curiosity, was unlikely to attack a man. And Miss Hartnell, though nosy, was not violent. Someone else had entered that house, struck Mr. Crane, and left without a trace, or so they thought. Back in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Gibbs, hoping to glean more from the housekeeper's nervous demeanour. Mrs. Gibbs was in her kitchen, kneading dough with more force than necessary. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, her hands pausing, "I can't stop thinking about poor Mr. Crane. To think it happened while I was at home, sleeping." "You've had a terrible shock," Miss Marple said, settling at the table. "I wonder, Mrs. Gibbs, did you ever notice anything unusual in the Grantham house? Visitors, perhaps, or anything Mr. Crane seemed worried about?" Mrs. Gibbs shook her head, flour dusting her apron. "He was always quiet, kept to his work. I'd clean the parlour and kitchen, but he didn't like me in the basement, said it was his private space. Once, though I saw a letter on his desk from some London firm, he snatched it up quick when he saw me looking." Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting the consistency with Mr. Wilson's account. "And the night before you found him, Mrs. Gibbs did you hear the tapping, or see anyone near the house?" "I heard the tapping, same as always," Mrs. Gibbs said, her voice low. "Thought it was him working, like usual, but I saw no one. The lane was quiet, except for Miss Hartnell, poking about as she does." Miss Marple thanked her and stepped back into the village, her thoughts circling the locked door. The smudge on the basement windowsill, the flattened grass, the hidden screwdriver, these were signs of an intruder, but one who knew the house's layout. She recalled a burglary in St. Mary Mead years ago, when a thief had entered through a coal chute, leaving only a smudge of soot. Could the basement window be the key? As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting needles clicking softly. The radiator's rhythm had explained the tapping, but the coffee message pointed to a human hand. Mr. Crane's invention, his refusal to sell, and the interest from London suggested a motive rooted in greed. The man in the grey coat, the woman from Meridian Tech, and the letters from Barlow and Sons were threads she would follow. Tomorrow she would ask Craddock to check the basement window for prints and to trace the London firms. The Grantham house, with its secrets and shadows, was beginning to speak, and Miss Marple was listening. Chapter 7. The Village Suspects. The morning sun rose over St. Mary Mead with a pale, reluctant glow, as if hesitant to illuminate the undercurrents of unease that rippled through the village. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a cup of tea and a slice of buttered toast, gazed out at the garden, her mind weaving through the threads of the Grantham house mystery. The radiators clanging, confirmed by Mr. Pye as the source of the mysterious tapping, had dispelled one illusion, but the coffee-stained spelling help on Mr. Crane's parlour rug remained a stark testament to a violent act. Someone had entered that locked house, struck the reclusive engineer, and left him to be found. And Miss Marple was determined to uncover who and why. Her inquiries had painted a picture of Mr. Crane as a man of solitary habits. His life centred on a device he called the Morse Enhancer, a creation that had drawn interest from London firms like Barlow and Sons and Meridian Tech. The man in the grey coat, seen by Miss Hartnell and Mr. Wilson, and the woman from Meridian Tech, mentioned by Tommy Pierce, were shadows on the edges of the puzzle. But Miss Marple knew that village life, with its quiet routines and watchful eyes, often held the key to such mysteries. The suspects closest to the Grantham house, Mrs. Gibbs, Tommy Pierce, and even Miss Hartnell, deserved closer scrutiny, for in St. Mary Mead, the ordinary often concealed the extraordinary. Miss Marple began her day with a visit to Mrs. Gibbs, the housekeeper whose key to the Grantham house made her a natural, if reluctant, figure of interest. Mrs. Gibbs lived in a small cottage near the church, its windows adorned with laced curtains that fluttered as Miss Marple knocked. The housekeeper opened the door, her face pale and her hands twisting a damp dishcloth. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, her voice quavering, "I was just thinking of you. This business with Mr. Cranitz got me all in a flutter. I can't bear to think I was in that house, cleaning, and someone might have been lurking." Miss Marple stepped inside, her expression one of gentle concern. "It's a dreadful thing, Mrs. Gibbs. I wonder if you might tell me a bit more about your time in the Grantham house. You were there regularly, I understand, and you might have seen something of detail, perhaps that seemed unimportant at the time." Mrs. Gibbs led her to the kitchen, where a kettle steamed on the stove. "I went in 3 times a week," she said, pouring tea with unsteady hands. "Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, always at 8 sharp. Mr. Crane liked things tidy, but he was particular about his basement, wouldn't let me touch it. Said it was his work, and he didn't want it disturbed. I'd clean the parlour, the kitchen, and the upstairs, and that was that." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes fixed on Mrs. Gibbs. "And did you ever notice anything out of the ordinary? Letters, perhaps, or signs that Mr. Crane was worried?" Mrs. Gibbs hesitated, her fingers tightening on her cup. "Well, he was more on edge these last few weeks. Snapped at me once for moving a paper on his desk, a letter from London, with a fancy crest. I didn't read it, mind, but he was quick to hide it. And once, when I came in early, I heard him arguing on the telephone something about patents and not selling out. He went quiet when he saw me." This aligned with Mr. Crane's account of refusing offers for his Morse enhancer, and Miss Marple made a mental note. "And the morning you found him, Mrs. Gibbskin, you recall anything unusual? The door was locked, I believe, but was there anything else, a sound, a smell, anything out of place?" Mrs. Gibbs's eyes darted to the window, as if expecting to see someone there. "The door was locked, yes, and I used my key. The house was quiet, except for that tapping in the walls, same as I'd heard before. I thought it was Mr. Crane working, till I saw him lying there. The coffee smell was strong, and the cup was warm, like he'd just poured it. I didn't notice anything else. I was so shaken." Miss Marple nodded, her mind lingering on. The warm cup. The attack, then, had been recent, perhaps only minutes before Mrs. Gibbs's arrival. The locked door suggested the intruder had a key or another means of entry, like the basement window with its telltale smudge. Mrs. Gibbs's nervousness was understandable, but was it fear or guilt? Miss Marple recalled a village seamstress, years ago, whose trembling hands had betrayed not fear but a secret she dared not confess. "Thank you, Mrs. Gibbs," she said, rising. "You've been most helpful. Try not to worry, Inspector. Craddock will get to the bottom of this." Her next stop was the Pierce household, where young Tommy Pierce was kicking a football against the garden wall. His freckled face lit up at the sight of Miss Marple, though his grin held a hint of mischief. "Miss Marple, you hear about Mr. Crane? I told you. I heard that tapping bet. It's got something to do with it." Miss Marple settled on a bench, her umbrella resting beside her. "You've a sharp ear, Tommy, and a sharper eye. I wonder if you've seen anything else near the Grantham house, someone lingering, perhaps, or anything odd in Mr. Crane's garden. Tommy scuffed his shoe in the dirt, his expression turning thoughtful. Well, I told you about that London lady, but there was something else, now I think of it. A couple of nights back, I saw a light in Mr. Crane's basement late, past 10. Not a lamp, but a flickering, like a torch. I thought maybe he was working, but it moved funny, like someone was creeping about. Miss Marple's interest quickened. A torch in the basement suggested an intruder, perhaps the same person who left the smudge on the windowsill. Did you see anyone, Tommy, or hear anything besides the tapping? Nah, it was too dark, he admitted. But I did find something. The next day, in the grass by the basement window, a bit of cloth, grey-like, caught on a thorn. I left it there, didn't think much of it till now. This was a new clue, and Miss Marple's mind raced to connect it with Miss Hartnell's man in the grey coat. You did well to notice, Tommy, she said, slipping him a shilling. If you see anything else, come straight to me or Inspector. Of Craddock. Her final call was to Miss Hartnell, whose cottage was a bastion of village opinion. Miss Hartnell was in her parlour, sorting through a pile of knitting patterns. Her hat a vivid purple creation perched on a side table. Miss Marple, she exclaimed, waving her in. I knew you'd be sniffing about. That Grantham House business is a disgrace, a man attacked in his own home. I blame Mr. Crane's secretive ways. If he'd been more neighbourly, this mightn't have happened. Miss Marple smiled faintly, settling into a chair. You may be right, Miss Hartnell. You mentioned seeing a stranger near the Grantham house. Man in a grey coat. Could you tell me more? His manner, perhaps, or anything he did? Miss Hartnell's eyes gleamed with the thrill of being useful. Oh, he was shifty, no doubt about it. Tall, with a city look-smart coat, but his hat was pulled low, like he didn't want to be seen. I spotted him by the Grantham gate, just standing there, looking at the house. When I called out to ask his business, he turned and walked off sharpish, toward the station. I'd wager he was up to no good. Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles emerging from her bag as if by instinct. And have you noticed anything else in the lane lights, perhaps, or sounds besides the tapping? Miss Hartnell leaned forward, her voice dropping conspiratorially. Now you mention it, I did see a light in the Grantham house 2 nights ago, down low, like in the basement. I thought it was Mr. Crane, but now I wonder. And there was a car parked near the church that same night, not a local one. Dark blue, with a dented fender. It was gone by morning. This was new, and Miss Marple's mind seized on it. A car, a torchlight, a scrap of grey clothies were signs of someone watching or entering the Grantham house. She thanked Miss Hartnell and stepped back into the lane, her thoughts racing. The village suspects Mrs. Gibbs, Tommy, and Miss Hartnell had each added a piece to the puzzle, but none seemed the culprit. Mrs. Gibbs's key made her a possibility, but her distress felt genuine. Tommy's curiosity was boundless, but violence was beyond him. Miss Hartnell, for all her meddling, was more likely to gossip than to strike. Inspector Craddock met her at the Grantham house, where his men were wrapping up their search. Miss Marple, he said, his tone a mix of exasperation and respect. You've been busy, I hear. Found anything we've missed? She shared Tommy's account of the torchlight and the grey cloth, and Miss Hartnell's sighting of the car. And the wrench, Inspector, she added. Have you learned more about it? Craddock nodded. The lab found blood on it, human, likely Mr. Crane's. No prints, though, which is odd. Whoever used it was careful gloves. Maybe. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Gloves suggested premeditation, and the lack of prints on the wrench matched the careful entry through the basement window. She recalled a theft in St. Mary Mead years ago, when a gloved hand had left no trace but a smudge of wax on a windowsill. "Inspector," she said, "have your men checked the basement window for prints? And perhaps the grass outside, where—" Tommy saw that cloth. Craddock's eyebrows rose. "We dusted the sill, nothing clear, just a smudge, like grease. But we'll look again, and I'll have someone check the grass." "You think someone came in that way?" "It's possible," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but certain. "The house was locked, but a window is a quiet way in. And the cloth—" Tommy found grey, like the coat Miss Hartnell saw might belong to our intruder. As Craddock gave orders to his men, Miss Marple lingered in the parlour, her eyes on the coffee stain. The letters, HLP, now barely visible, were a testament to Mr. Crane's clarity in crisis. She pictured him, struck down, using the spilled coffee to leave his message, final act of defiance. The wrench, the window, the cloth all pointed. To an outsider, perhaps the man in the grey coat, driven by a desire for Mr. Crane's invention. The London letters, from Barlow and Sons and Meridian Tech, suggested a commercial motive, but the violence spoke of something personal or desperate as she walked back to Danemead Cottage, the village settling into its evening hush. Miss Marple's mind was a whirl of possibilities. The suspects in St. Mary Mead were not the answer, she felt certain. The truth lay with the strangers who had come to the village, drawn by Mr. Crane's work. Tomorrow she would ask Craddock to trace the London firms and the mysterious car. The Grantham house, with its radiator's rhythm and its coffee-stained plea, was speaking, and Miss Marple was listening, ready to unravel its secrets stitch by stitch. Chapter 8. The coffee's tales. The late morning sky over St. Mary Mead hung heavy with clouds, casting a muted light over the village that seemed to mirror the sombre mood of its residents. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her cosy sitting room at Danemead Cottage, sipped her tea with a thoughtful air, her knitting needles resting momentarily in her lap. The mystery of the Grantham house had deepened with each revelation, and the coffee stain on the parlour rug, those faint, desperate letters spelling help, remained the most poignant clue. The radiator's mechanical clanging, identified by Mr. Pye as the source of the tapping, had dispelled the notion of a deliberate signal, but the coffee message was undeniably human. A final act by Mr. Leonard Crane to name his peril. Miss Marple's mind, sharp and patient, turned to this stain, sensing it held the key to unraveling. The attack that had left a man unconscious and a village on edge. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Craddock, who knocked briskly before entering, his face a mix of determination and faint exasperation. "Miss Marple," he said, settling into an armchair, "you've got me chasing shadows with that windowsill and grass. We found a scrap of grey cloth, just as young Tommy said, caught on a thorn by the basement window. No prints, though the smudge was to faint, and the screwdriver from the basement. Clean, no blood, but it's odd it was tucked away like that." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Odd, indeed, Inspector. Small things, you know, often tell the larger stories. I'd like to see the parlour again, if I may. The coffee stain has been on my mind, and I believe it has more to say." Craddock nodded, accustomed to her requests. "The house is still under guard, but I'll take you there myself. We've had no new leads, and Mr. Crane's still too weak to say much more. That wrench is our best bet, but without prints, it's—" A dead end for now. The Grantham house, as they approached, stood silent under the grey sky, its ivy-clad walls giving it an air of brooding secrecy. The constable at the door stepped aside, and Miss Marple entered the parlour, her step light, but purposeful. The room was unchanged from her last visit, the cold fireplace, the telegraph key on its table, the bookshelf heavy with technical volumes, but her attention fixed on the rug, with a coffee stain, now dry and brittle, formed the ghostly letters HLP. She knelt, her knees protesting only slightly, and studied the stain with the care of an archaeologist examining a relic. The letters were uneven, scrawled in haste, yet their formation suggested intent. The coffee had spread unevenly, pooling in the rug's weave, but the shapes were deliberate, as if Mr. Crane had dragged his finger through the liquid to form each stroke. Miss Marple pictured the scene, a man startled, perhaps by a noise, turning to face an intruder. A blow to the temple, the cup falling, coffee spilling, and then, in his fading moments, the strength to leave a message. It was an act of extraordinary clarity, she thought, recalling a village widow years ago who had scrawled her husband's name in flour on a kitchen table as she collapsed, poisoned. People, she murmured, are remarkably resilient, even at the end. She rose, her gaze shifting to the small table where the telegraph key sat. Its wires, neatly coiled, were still disconnected, a detail that nagged at her. Why had Mr. Crane brought it to the parlour, away from his basement workshop? Was he testing it when he was attacked, or had he intended to send a signal? The Morse enhancer diagram, safely tucked in her handbag, suggested a device meant to amplify signals, perhaps for commercial use. Could he have been demonstrating it to someone, a buyer or a thief? "Inspector," she said, turning to Craddock, "have you traced those London firms Barlow and Sons and Meridian Tech?" Mr. Crane mentioned refusing an offer from Meridian, and Mr. Wilson spoke of letters from both. Craddock nodded, pulling a notebook from his pocket. "We've sent inquiries. Barlow and Sons is a supplier of electrical components, big in the telegraph industry. Meridian Tech's newer, working on wireless innovations. Both had dealings with Crane, but Meridian's been more persistent. Their representative, Miss Clara Barlow, no relation to the other firm, visited him last week. According to the station master, she took the evening train back to London after a short stay." Miss Marple's lips pursed. Clara Barlow, the woman Tommy Pierce had seen, was a name to pursue. "And the man in the grey coat?" she asked. "Any trace of him?" "Nothing." "Solid," Craddock admitted. "The station master remembers a man matching that description on the same day as Miss Barlow, but he didn't buy a ticket. Could have driven. Miss Hartnell mentioned a car, dark blue with a dented fender. We're checking garages in Much Benham, but it's a long shot." Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving these threads. The grey cloth by the basement window, the car, the London visitors' hall, pointed to an outsider, yet the locked door suggested familiarity with the house. She recalled a burglary in St. Mary Mead years ago, when a servant's cousin had used a borrowed key to slip inside, leaving only a faint mark on a windowsill. Could someone have obtained a key or known of the basement window's vulnerability? She moved to the fireplace, where a faint draught stirred the ashes, and then to the window overlooking the garden. The flattened grass and the thorn-caught cloth were outside, invisible from here, but their presence lingered in her thoughts. "Inspector," she said, "I wonder if we might recreate the moment of the attack. It could help us understand the coffee's tale." Craddock raised an eyebrow, but humoured her. "What do you have in mind?" "Let us suppose," she said, her voice soft but precise, that Mr. Crane was here, in the parlor, with his coffee. He hears a noise perhaps from the basement, or the front door. He turns, the cup in his hand, and is struck. The cup falls. The coffee spills, and he writes help before he collapses. Where was he standing, and where was the attacker? Craddock considered, pacing the room. The wrench hit his temple, so the blow came from the side, likely his right. He was facing the fireplace, we think, from the way he fell. The cup landed near his hand, and the coffee spread toward the rug's edge. Miss Marple nodded, visualizing it. Then the attacker was behind him, perhaps entering from the hallway, but the door was locked when Mrs. Gibbs arrived, and the basement window shows no signs of being forced. Could the attacker have locked the door after leaving? Possible, Craddock said. Mrs. Gibbs's key was accounted for, but Crane might have had a spare. We didn't find one, though. Miss Marple's mind turned to the telegraph key. Or perhaps, she said, Mr. Crane was working with this key when he was struck. He might have been testing his device, expecting a visitor. The coffee was warm, Mrs. Gibbs said, so it was. Recent. Could someone have knocked, been let in, and then attacked? Craddock frowned. That fits, but it means Crane knew his attacker or trusted them enough to open the door. Exactly, Miss Marple said, her eyes bright. And the coffee message suggests he knew he was in danger, even if only at the last moment. He chose coffee, Inspector, because it was at hand. A pen was on the desk, but too far. The telephone was across the room. But coffee, spilled in his fall, was his voice. She stepped back, letting the room settle around her. The parlor, with its heavy drapes and faded grandeur, seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for her to see what it hid. She thought of Mr. Crane's solitary life, his Morse enhancer, the London firms circling like hawks. The woman, Clara Barlow, had offered to buy his plans and been refused. The man in the grey coat, elusive and unnamed, had lingered near the house, and the car with the dented fender, seen by Miss Hartnell, suggested a visitor who came and went. In secret, as they left the Grantham house, Miss Marple paused in the garden, her eyes on the basement window. The smudge, the cloth, the flattened grass, these were signs of stealth, of someone who knew the house's weaknesses. She recalled a village scandal years ago, when a grocer's assistant had slipped through a cellar door to steal preserves, thinking himself unseen. The intruder here was cleverer, but not invisible. "Inspector," she said, "I think we should speak to Miss Barlow from Meridian Tech, and perhaps check with the Much Benham garages about that car. It may belong to our man in the grey coat." Craddock nodded, jotting in his notebook. "I'll send a wire to London and get my men on the garages. Anything else, Miss Marple?" She smiled faintly. "Only that we must listen to the coffee, Inspector. It speaks for Mr. Crane, and it will lead us to the truth." As they parted, Miss Marple walked back to Danemead Cottage, the village quiet around her. The clouds had parted, revealing a sliver of blue sky, but her thoughts were on the parlour rug, the telegraph key, the hidden screwdriver. The suspects, Mrs. Gibbs, Tommy Pierce, Miss Hartnell, were unlikely culprits, their roles limited to observation and gossip. The real danger, she felt certain, came from outside St. Mary Mead, from those who coveted Mr. Crane's invention. The coffee's tale was one of desperation and clarity, and Miss Marple, with her patient, probing mind, would follow it to its end, stitch by careful stitch. Chapter 9. The false signal. The early afternoon in St. Mary Mead carried a deceptive calm. the kind that cloaked secrets beneath the ordinary rhythms of village life. Miss Jane Marple, her black handbag tucked under her arm, stepped out of Danemead Cottage with a quiet determination, her thoughts fixed on the Grantham house and its enigmatic clues. The radiators clanging, identified by Mr. Pye as the source of the tapping that had alarmed Mrs. Harrow and Tommy Pierce, had unravelled one thread of the mystery, revealing it as a mechanical quirk rather than a deliberate cry. Yet the coffee stain on the parlour rug, spelling help in Mr. Crane's desperate hand, remained a vivid testament to a real and violent danger. Miss Marple's mind, as sharp as the needles in her knitting bag, turned to the possibility that the tapping, though false, had masked a truth one she intended to uncover. Her morning had been spent in reflection, piecing together the fragments of testimony from the village and beyond. Mr. Crane, recovering in Mudge Benham's hospital, had confirmed his work on the Morse enhancer, a device coveted by London firms like Barlow and Sons and Meridian Tech. The woman from Meridian, Clara Barlow, had been refused her offer to buy his plans, while the man in the grey coat, seen by Miss Hartnell and Mr. Wilson, lingered as a shadow of suspicion. The scrap of grey cloth by the basement window, the smudge on the sill, and the dark blue car with a dented fender pointed to an intruder from outside St. Mary Mead. Yet the locked door of the Grantham house suggested a deeper familiarity, a puzzle Miss Marple was determined to solve. She decided to return to the Grantham house, hoping the daylight might reveal what shadows had concealed. Inspector Craddock, reached by telephone, agreed to meet her there, his voice carrying a mix of respect and curiosity. "You're like a hound on a scent, Miss Marple," he said. "We've got a lead on that car garage in Much Benham reported. A blue sedan with a dented fender, rented last week to a man named Edward Barlow. No relation to Clara, as far as we know, but we're checking his background." Miss Marple's interest quickened at the name. "Barlow, you say? That's curious, Inspector. I'd be grateful if you could trace his connection to the London firms, and perhaps Miss Clara Barlow as well. She seems a determined sort." The Grantham house stood silent under the grey afternoon sky, its windows reflecting the clouds like unblinking eyes. The constable at the door nodded her through, and Craddock joined her in the parlour, where the air still held a faint bitterness of coffee. The rug, with its nor-fading stain, drew Miss Marple's gaze. She knelt, her eyes tracing the letters HLP, their edges blurred but unmistakable. "This was no accident," she said softly. "Mr. Crane knew his danger, and he used what he had to speak." Craddock crouched beside her, his notebook open. The lab confirmed the wrench had his blood, but still no prints. "The cloth from the garden is being analysed, grey wool, good quality, likely from a coat. And the basement windowsill had that smudge grease, they think, but too faint for a clear print." Miss Marple nodded, her mind picturing the scene. Mr. Crane in the parlour, perhaps testing his telegraph key, a knock or a noise, then a blow from behind. The coffee spills, and he writes his message, a final act of defiance. But why the parlour? Why not his basement workshop, where his tools and plans were kept? She moved to the telegraph key, its brass dull in the dim light. "Inspector," she said, "have you considered that Mr. Crane might have been expecting someone? The key is here, not in the basement. Perhaps he was demonstrating his device when he was attacked." Craddock's eyebrows rose. "You think he let the attacker in? That would explain the locked door, no forced entry, just someone he trusted, or at least admitted." "Precisely," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but firm. "And the tapping the radiators false signal may have confused us all. Mrs. Harrow and Tommy heard it and thought it was Mr. Crane signaling for help. But he was already unconscious, and the real message was here, in the coffee. She stepped to the window, overlooking the garden where the grass was still flattened near the basement window. The scrap of grey cloth, now in police hands, suggested an intruder who had come by stealth, perhaps watching Mr. Crane before entering. She recalled a village theft years ago when a poacher had left a torn glove on a fence, betraying his presence. "Inspector," she said, "have you searched the basement again? The screwdriver I saw, hidden behind a crate, seemed out of place in a workshop." Craddock nodded. "We took it for testing. No blood, no prints, but you'll write it. Was odd, tucked away like that." We also found a small tool bag in the basement, half hidden under a tarp. Contained pliers, wire cutters, and a notebook with more diagrams, similar to the one you found. Miss Marple's lips pursed. The notebook, likely filled with Mr. Crane's plans for the Morse enhancer, was a prize worth stealing. Had the intruder come for it, only to be interrupted? She pictured Mr. Crane in the parlour, perhaps meeting with Clara Barlow or the man in the grey coat, discussing his invention. A disagreement, a sudden blow, and then the coffee message. But the locked door remained a puzzle unless the attacker had a key or had locked it on their way out to delay discovery. She moved to the hallway, where the pile of letters still sat on the small table. With Craddock's permission, she sifted through them again, noting another from Barlow and Sons, this one marked urgent. The envelope was unopened, suggesting Mr. Crane had not seen it before his attack. "Inspector," she said, "this letter may hold a clue. Could you have it opened carefully to see what it contains?" Craddock agreed, calling over a constable to bag the letter for analysis. "We'll check it for prints first, then read it." "You think it's tied to the motive?" "I think," Miss Marple said, her eyes distant, "that Mr. Crane's work was his life, and someone wanted to take a tour, stop it. The coffee tells us he knew his danger, but the tapping misled us, a false signal that kept us looking in the wrong direction." They descended to the basement, where the air was damp and cool. The radiator pipe silent now that Mr. Pye had tightened its joint. Miss Marple examined the workbench, its clutter of wires and components a testament to Mr. Crane's dedication. The tool bag Craddock mentioned lay open, its contents neatly arranged, as if someone had searched it and left it in haste. She noticed a faint scratch on the workbench, fresh and metallic, as if a tool had been dragged across it. "Inspector," she said, pointing, "this mark, could it be from the wrench or something else?" Craddock peered at it, his brow furrowing. "Could be. We'll have it photographed." "You think the attacker was looking for something down here?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. "The notebook, or the plans themselves. Mr. Crane refused to sell, and that refusal may have cost him dearly." As they returned upstairs, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the village. Mrs. Gibbs, with her key, was a possibility, but her fear seemed to roar for guilt. Tommy Pierce, curious and bold, might have seen more than he admitted, but violence was beyond him. Miss Hartnell's sightings of the grey-coated man and the dented car pointed to an outsider, as did the London letters. Yet the locked door suggested someone who knew the house's rhythms. Perhaps someone who had watched Mr. Crane, waiting for the right moment. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead years ago, when a travelling salesman had posed as a repairman to gain entry to a widow's home, leaving only a faint mark on a lock. The intruder here was cleverer, using the basement window or a stolen key, and the radiator's clanging had covered their tracks, creating a false signal that misled the neighbours. But the coffee, deliberate and clear, was Mr. Crane's true voice, and Miss Marple was determined to hear it. As they stepped into the garden, Craddock received a call on his radio. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice tight, "the garage in much. Benham just confirmed the car was rented by Edward Barlow, who gave a London address. We've traced him to Barlow and Sons. He's their chief engineer. And Clara Barlow from Meridian Tech has agreed to come in for questioning tomorrow." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "To Barlow's inspector from different firms. That's no coincidence. I think we're close to understanding the coffee's tale." She walked back to the village, the clouds parting to reveal a weak sun. The Grantham house, with its false signal and true message, was beginning to yield its secrets. The grey cloth, the car, the urgent letter all pointed to a motive rooted in Mr. Crane's refusal to part with his invention. Tomorrow she would join Craddock to question Clara Barlow and perhaps learn more about Edward. The coffee had spoken, and Miss Marple, with her patient, probing mind, would follow its lead to the truth, unraveling the mystery one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 10. The Hidden Motive. The morning mist clung to St. Mary Mead like a delicate veil, softening the outlines of the cottages and lending an air of quiet mystery to the village. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a cup of tea and a neatly buttered scone, gazed out at the garden, her thoughts fixed on the Grantham house and the intricate web of clues surrounding Mr. Leonard Crane's attack. The radiators clanging, mistaken for a Morse code plea, had been a false signal, a mechanical quirk that misled the neighbours. But the coffee stain on the parlour rug, spelling help in Mr. Crane's desperate hand, was a true cry, a testament to a violent act that demanded answers. With Inspector Craddock's latest findings, the grey cloth, the dented car, and the involvement of Edward Barlow from Barlow and Sons, Miss Marple felt the threads of the mystery drawing tighter, pointing to a motive hidden in the shadows of ambition and greed. Her mind turned to the timeline of that fateful night. Mr. Crane, alone in his parlour, perhaps testing his Morse enhancer or meeting a visitor, had been struck from behind, the wrench leaving a bloody mark on his temple. The coffee cup fell, and in his fading moments he scrawled help on the rug, a message that spoke of clarity in crisis. The locked door, the smudge on the basement windowsill, and the scrap of grey cloth suggested an intruder who moved with stealth, perhaps entering through the window or with a key. The radiators clanging, mistaken for Morse code, had confused Mrs. Harrow and young Tommy Pierce, masking the true nature of the crime. But the involvement of Clara Barlow from Meridian Tech and Edward Barlow from Barlow and Sons pointed to a deeper motive, one tied to Mr. Crane's refusal to sell his invention. Miss Marple decided to revisit the Grantham house, hoping to piece together the sequence of events in the light of these new clues. She telephoned Inspector Craddock, who agreed to meet her there, his voice carrying a note of anticipation. "We've got Edward Barlow's address in London," he said. "He's due for questioning this afternoon, and Clara Barlow is coming in from Meridian Tech. Your instincts about those firms were spot on, Miss Marple. The letter from Barlow and Sons, we opened it a demand for Crane to hand over his plans or face legal action over a patent dispute." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "A patent dispute, Inspector. That's a powerful motive. I'd like to see the parlour again, and perhaps the basement. The coffee and the telegraph key have more to tell us, I think." The Grantham house loomed under the morning mist, its red brick facade as unyielding as ever. The constable at the door nodded her through, and Craddock joined her in the parlour, where the air was cool and faintly musty. The coffee stain on the rug, now a brittle shadow, still bore the ghostly letters, HLP, a silent accusation. Miss Marple knelt, her eyes tracing the uneven strokes. He was falling when he wrote this, she murmured. The cup broke, the coffee spilled, and he used his last strength to form these letters. He knew his attacker, or at least the danger they posed. Craddock nodded, his notebook open. The wrench confirms it Crane's blood, no prints. The cloth from the garden is a match for a high-quality wool coat, likely our man in the grey coat. And the car, a dark blue sedan with a dented fender, was rented by Edward Barlow, who's been with Barlow and Sons for a decade. We're checking if he was in St. Mary Mead that night. Miss Marple rose, her gaze shifting to the telegraph key. On the small table, its wires, still disconnected, suggested Mr. Crane had been preparing to use it, perhaps to demonstrate his Morse enhancer. She pictured him in the parlour, a visitor at the door, Clara Barlow, offering to buy his plans, or Edward Barlow pressing his firm's claim. A disagreement, a raised voice, then a sudden blow. But why the parlour and not the basement where his work was kept? She recalled a village quarrel years ago, when a farmer's wife had confronted a thief in her kitchen, only to be struck with a rolling pin. The choice of room, she thought, was significant. Mr. Crane had been caught off guard, away from his workshop. "Inspector," she said, "let us reconstruct the moment. Suppose Mr. Crane was here, with his coffee and the telegraph key. He hears a knock, or perhaps a noise from the basement. He turns, and the blow comes from the side, his right temple, you said. The cup falls, he collapses, and he writes help. The attacker locks the door and leaves. Perhaps through the front or the basement window." Craddock paced the room, visualizing it. That fits. The blow came from his right, so the attacker was likely standing here, near the fireplace. The coffee spilled toward the rug's edge, and the cup's shards were scattered, as if he dropped it mid-turn. But the locked door, either they had a key, or they locked it on their way out to delay discovery. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the basement window. The smudge and the cloth suggest the window as an entry point. The grass was flattened, as if someone crouched there, watching. But the locked door implies they left another way, perhaps. The front, if Mr. Crane let them in first. They descended to the basement, where the air was damp and heavy with the scent of metal and oil. The workbench, cluttered with wires and tools, bore the faint scratch Miss Marple had noticed before. A mark that could have come from the wrench or another tool. The tool bag, half hidden under a tarp, contained pliers and wire cutters. But the notebook Craddock had found was now in police hands, its diagrams likely detailing the Morse enhancer. Miss Marple examined the radiator pipe, now silent after Mr. Pye's repairs, and recalled its clanging, a false signal that had misled the village into thinking Mr. Crane was calling for help. The radiator, she said, was a clever distraction, though not intentional. It masked the real crime, making us think the tapping was a plea. But the coffee tells the true story: an attack, sudden and planned. Craddock frowned, his notebook flipping shut. Planned, you think? The wrench suggests opportunities. Someone grabbed it from the basement. But the lack of prints means they were careful, maybe wearing gloves. Exactly, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but certain. And the coffee suggests Mr. Crane suspected danger, even if only at the last moment. He chose the rug because it was near, the coffee his only tool. A pen was on the desk, but too far. The telephone was across the room. He acted with what he had, as people often do. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead years ago, when a schoolteacher, poisoned, had scratched a name into her desk with a hairpin. A final act that led to her killer's arrest. Mr. Crane's message was simple, desperate bid to be heard. But who had he feared? Clara Barlow, whose offer he rejected. Edward Barlow, whose firm claimed a patent. Or someone else, unseen but watching. They returned to the parlour, where Miss Marple lingered by the window overlooking the garden. Flattened grass and the thorn-caught cloth were gone now, taken as evidence, but their presence lingered in her mind. She pictured the intruder, perhaps Edward Barlow, crouching by the basement window, waiting for the right moment. The car with the dented fender, rented in his name, placed him in the village, but the locked door suggested he had been let in, or had a key perhaps stolen or copied from Mrs. Gibbs's set. "Inspector," she said, "have you checked Mrs. Gibbs's key? She said it was accounted for, but could someone have borrowed it or made a copy?" Craddock's eyes narrowed. "Good thought. She keeps it on a ring in her kitchen," she said. "We'll ask if anyone could have taken it, even briefly. And we're still tracing that letter from Barlow and Sons. It mentions a patent Crane allegedly infringed, but it's vague on details." Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the London firms. Barlow and Sons, with their engineer Edward Barlow, had a legal claim, but their urgency suggested desperation. Meridian Tech, represented by Clara Barlow, had offered to buy the plans outright, a move that spoke of ambition. The coincidence of two Barlows was curious, though Craddock had found no familial link. She recalled a village dispute years ago when two rival shopkeepers, unrelated but sharing a surname, had clashed over a delivery contract leading to sabotage. Could a similar rivalry drive this crime? As they left the Grantham house, Craddock received a call on his radio. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice tense, "Edward Barlow's been located in London. He admits visiting St. Mary Mead last week, but claims it was for a business meeting with Crane, not violence. He says he left the same day, by train, not car. We're bringing him in for questioning." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing, and Clara Barlow, "Inspector. Her visit was the same day, I believe. We must ask if they met, or if their interests clashed." Back in the village, Miss Marple visited Mr. Wilson at the post office, hoping for more on Mr. Crane's correspondence. The postmaster, sorting a fresh batch of letters, greeted her with a nod. "Miss Marple, you're still on about Mr. Crane, I wager. I've remembered something. Another letter came for him, just before the attack. From Meridian Tech. It was marked personal, not like their usual ones. I gave it to him myself, and he looked troubled, tucked it away quick." This was new, and Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Troubled, you say? Did he mention anything about it?" "Not a word," Mr. Wilson said, "but he was quieter than usual, like something was weighing on him." As she walked back to Danemead Cottage, the mist lifting to reveal a pale sun, Miss Marple's thoughts wove the clues into a pattern. The coffee message was Mr. Crane's truth, the radiator a false signal that hid the crime's immediacy. Edward Barlow, with his rented car and grey coat, was a prime suspect, his firm's patent dispute a clear motive. Clara Barlow, rebuffed in her offer, might have acted out of frustration, though her role was less clear. The locked door, the smudge, the cloth all pointed to a careful intruder, one who knew the house's vulnerabilities. She sat by her fire that evening, her knitting needles clicking softly. The hidden motive, she felt certain, lay in Mr. Crane's refusal to yield. His Morse enhancer. The London firms, with their competing interests, had sent representatives to press their claims, but one had turned to violence. Tomorrow, With Craddock's questioning of Edward and Clara Barlow, the truth would come closer. The coffee's tale, clear and desperate, was leading her to the heart of the mystery, and Miss Marple, with her patient, probing mind, would follow it to its end, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 11. The confrontation. The morning air in St. Mary Mead was crisp and heavy with the scent of damp earth, as if the village itself were holding its breath, awaiting the unraveling of the Grantham House mystery. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a cup of tea and a single slice of toast, gazed out at the garden, her thoughts a delicate web of clues and suspicions. The coffee stains spelling help on Mr. Crane's parlour rug, the false signal of the radiators clanging, and the traces of an intruder, the smudge on the basement windowsill. The grey cloth, the dented car head, brought the investigation to a critical juncture. Inspector Craddock's latest findings, pointing to Edward Barlow of Barlow and Sons as a prime suspect, had sharpened the focus, but Miss Marple sensed the truth was close, hidden in the interplay of motives and opportunities. Her mind retraced the timeline. Mr. Crane, working late in his parlour, perhaps with his Morse enhancer, had been struck from behind, the wrench leaving a bloody mark on his temple. The spilled coffee, shaped into a desperate plea, was his final act of clarity. The radiator's rhythmic banging, mistaken for Morse code, had misled the neighbours, while the locked door and the basement windows smudge suggested a careful intruder. Edward Barlow, with his rented car and grey coat, had been in St. Mary Mead, his firm's patent dispute a clear motive. Clara Barlow of Meridian Tech, though unrelated, had also pressed Mr. Crane to sell his plans, her rejection a possible spark for violence, yet the locked door hinted at someone with access, or cunning enough to cover their tracks. Miss Marple decided to join Craddock for the questioning of Edward Barlow, who had been brought to the Much Benham police station. She telephoned him, her voice calm but insistent. "Inspector, I believe Mr. Barlow's interview could be pivotal. May I sit in? I have a few questions that might clarify matters." Craddock, accustomed to her persistence, agreed with a wry chuckle. "You've got a nose for this, Miss Marple. We're starting at 11, Clara Barlow's coming too, so we'll have them both. I'll send a car for you." The Much Benham police station, a squat building of grey stone, was a hive of quiet activity as Miss Marple arrived, her black handbag clutched tightly. Craddock met her at the entrance, his face tense but focused. "Edward Barlow's in the interview room," he said. "He's nervous, claims he was in St. Mary Mead for a meeting with Crane, nothing more. The car rental checks out, and the grey cloth matches a coat he owns, though he says he lost it weeks ago." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "Lost, you say? That's convenient. And Miss Barlow, she's here too, cool as you like," Craddock replied. "Says she met Crane to discuss a deal, left when he refused, and took the train back to London. No record of her staying overnight, but we're checking." They entered the interview room, where Edward Barlow sat at a plain table, his hands fidgeting with a pencil. He was a tall man, in his 40s, with sharp features and a city polish that seemed out of place in the rustic setting. His grey suit, though well cut, was slightly rumpled, and his eyes darted to Miss Marple with a mix of curiosity and unease. "Who's this?" he asked, his voice clipped. "Miss Marple, a consultant," Craddock said smoothly. "She's helping with the case. Now, Mr. Barlow, let's go over your story again. You were in St. Mary Mead last week, meeting Mr. Crane about his Morse enhancer. What happened?" Barlow leaned back, his fingers tightening on the pencil. I told you I work for Barlow and Sons. We've been after Crane's device for months. It's a signal amplifier, could revolutionize telegraphy. He claimed it infringed our patents, so I went to negotiate or warn him, if need be. He was stubborn, wouldn't budge. I left by the afternoon train, and that's that. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of gentle inquiry. Mr. Barlow, you were seen near the Grantham house, by the gate, in a grey coat. A scrap of such a coat was found caught on a thorn by the basement window. And a car, dark blue with a dented fender, rented in your name, was spotted in the village. Can you explain that? Barlow's face paled, but he held her gaze. I lost my coat weeks ago, must have been stolen. As for the car, I rented it for business in Much Benham, not St. Mary Mead. I drove to a meeting, parked near the church, and took the train back. Someone must have used it after me. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. His story was plausible, but the coincidence of the coat and car was troubling. She recalled a village swindler years ago who had claimed his stolen bicycle was used by another, only to be caught by a stray thread from his scarf. And did you enter the Grantham house, Mr. Barlow? She asked. Perhaps through the basement window where a smudge was found. Barlow's jaw tightened. No, I met Crane in his parlour at his invitation. We talked, argued a bit, and I left. The door was locked when I went. Crane was particular about that. Craddock leaned forward. A wrench was found in the basement, with Crane's blood on it. No prints, but you're an engineer, you'd know to wear gloves, wouldn't you? Barlow's pencil snapped in his hand. I didn't touch him. I'm not a thug, I negotiate contracts, not swing tools. If someone attacked Crane, it wasn't me. Miss Marple's voice was soft, almost soothing. Mr. Barlow, the coffee stain in the parlour spelled help. Mr. Crane wrote it as he fell after a blow to his temple. He knew his danger. If you argued, as you say, did he seem afraid? Did he mention anyone else? Barlow hesitated, his eyes flickering. He was edgy, kept looking at the window. Said something about Meridian Tech breathing down his neck, trying to steal his work. I told him we had a legal claim, and he got angry, said he'd never sell to anyone. That's when I left. This was new, and Miss Marple filed it away. Clara. Barlow's visit on the same day suggested a convergence of interests. She thanked Barlow and stepped out as Craddock prepared to question Clara. In the corridor, she reflected on his story. The lost coat, the rented car, the legal threat pointed to motive and opportunity, but his denial was firm. She thought of a St. Mary Mead gardener years ago, who had sworn he'd lost a spade used in a theft, only for its handle to betray his lie. Clara Barlow was brought in next, a poised woman in her 30s with sharp eyes and a tailored suit. Her demeanour was cool, professional, but Miss Marple noted a slight tension in her hands, clasped tightly on the table. Miss Barlow, Craddock began, you visited Mr. Crane last week, offering to buy his Morse enhancer. He refused, and you left. Is that correct? Clara nodded, her voice steady. Yes, Meridian Tech has been tracking Crane's work for months. His device could enhance our wireless systems, but he was stubborn, said it was his life's work, not for sale. I left by the evening train, as the station master will confirm. Miss Marple leaned forward, her tone gentle. Miss Barlow, were you aware of Barlow and Son's interest in Mr. Crane's work, or of a man in a grey coat seen near the Grantham house? Clara's eyes flickered, but she maintained her composure. I knew of Barlow and Sons their competitors. As for a man in a grey coat, I saw no one. I met Crane in his parlour, discussed the deal, and left when he refused. That's all. Miss Marple's mind quickened. Both Barlows claimed to have met Crane in the parlour, yet neither admitted to violence. The coffee stain, the wrench, the locked door all suggested a single attacker, but the timing was tight. She recalled a village scandal years ago when two suitors had called on the same woman in one evening, their overlapping visits sparking a fight. Could Edward and Clara have crossed paths, their motives colliding? "Inspector," she said, as they stepped out to confer. Both claimed to have left peaceably, but the coffee tells a different story. Mr. Crane was struck after a meeting, perhaps with one of them. The grey cloth points to Edward, but Clara's coolness troubles me. Could they have worked together, or did one follow the other? Craddock rubbed his chin. It's possible. Edward's car places him in the village, and the cloth is damning. Clara's train ticket checks out, but she could have returned. We'll press them both, check their alibis. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts turning to the Grantham house. She requested to return there, sensing the parlour held one final clue. Craddock drove her, and they entered the silent room, where the coffee stain seemed to pulse with urgency. Miss Marple stood by the telegraph key, picturing Mr. Crane's last moments. He was here, she said, perhaps showing his device. The attacker came from behind, near the fireplace. The wrench was in the basement. Did they fetch it, or was it already in the room? Craddock frowned. We assumed it came from the basement, but you're right, it could have been here, part of Crane's tools. No prints though, so gloves were likely. Miss Marple's eyes fell on the rug, where a faint mark caught her attention, a smudge. Not coffee, but a darker stain near the letters. She knelt, peering closely. "Inspector, look here. This isn't coffee, it's grease. Like the smudge on the windowsill." Craddock crouched beside her, his eyes widening. "You're right. Could be from the attacker's gloves. Gloves, maybe, like Edward Barlow might wear." Miss Marple's heart quickened. The grease linked the parlour to the basement window, and Edward Barlow, an engineer, was the likely source. She pictured him entering through the window, watching Crane, then slipping upstairs to confront him. An argument, a grab for the wrench, a blow. The coffee spills. Crane writes help, and Barlow locks the door, fleeing through the front. "To his car, Inspector," she said. "I believe Edward Barlow is our man." The grease, the cloth, the corral point to him. He came for the Morse enhancer, and when Crane refused, he struck in frustration. The locked door was his attempt to delay discovery. Craddock nodded, his face grim. "We'll bring him back. In, press him hard. If that grease matches, we've got him." As they left the Grantham house, Miss Marple felt the threads of the mystery tightening. The coffee's tale, the false signal of the radiator. The hidden motive all converged on Edward Barlow, whose ambition had turned to violence. Tomorrow's questioning would seal the truth, and Miss Marple, with her quiet, probing mind, would be there to see it unravel, stitch by careful stitch. Chapter 12. The Resolution. The pale light of a late July morning filtered through the lace curtains of Danemead Cottage, casting delicate patterns across Miss Jane Marple's sitting room, seated by her window with a cup of tea and her knitting. In her lap, she contemplated the final threads of the Grantham house mystery. The coffee stain spelling help on Mr. Crane's parlour rug had been the true cry. A desperate message from a man struck down in his own home. The radiators clanging, mistaken for Morse code, had been a false signal, misleading the village into believing Mr. Crane was signalling for aid. The smudge on the basement windowsill, the scrap of grey cloth, and the dented car had pointed to Edward Barlow of Barlow and Sons, whose ambition for Mr. Crane's Morse enhancer had driven him to violence. Today, Miss Marple would join Inspector Craddock at the Much Benham police station to witness the final confrontation. Certain that the truth, like a carefully knitted pattern, was about to emerge in full, her thoughts were interrupted by a knock. At the door, and Cherry Baker, her maid, ushered in Craddock, his face a mix of wariness and determination. "Miss Marple," he said, settling into an armchair, "we've got Edward Barlow back in for questioning. The grease on the rug matches. The smudge on the windowsill engineer's grease. The lab says, likely from gloves he wore. And his coat, the one he claimed was lost, was found in a London pawn shop, with a tear matching the cloth from the thorn. He's cracking, I think, but I'd value your presence. You've a way of seeing through people's stories." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "I'm flattered, Inspector. I'd like to hear Mr. Barlow's account again, and perhaps Miss Clara Barlow's, if she's still available. The coffee's tale has led us this far, and I believe it will guide us to the end." The Much Benham police station was bustling as they arrived, its corridors filled with the quiet hum of officers at work. Edward Barlow sat in the interview room, his sharp features drawn and his hands clasped tightly on the table. Across from him, Clara Barlow, composed but watchful, sat with her hands folded, her tailored suit as impeccable as ever. Craddock had decided to question them together, hoping to spark a reaction. Miss Marple took a seat in the corner, her small figure unobtrusive but her gaze keen, like a bird watching from a branch. Craddock began, his voice firm. "Mr. Barlow, we've got evidence tying you to the Grantham house. The grease on the parlour rug matches the smudge on the basement windowsill. Your coat, found in a pawn shop, matches the grey cloth caught on a thorn. And the car you rented, a dark blue sedan with a dented fender, was seen in St. Mary Mead the night Mr. Crane was attacked. Care to explain?" Barlow's jaw tightened, his eyes darting to Clara, then back to Craddock. "I told you I was there for a meeting, nothing more. I argued with Crane about the pattern, yes, but I didn't touch him. My coat was stolen, and I left the car in Much Benham. Someone else must have used it." Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice soft but piercing. "Mr. Barlow, the coffee stain in the parlour spelled help. Mr. Crane wrote it as he fell, struck by a wrench we found in the basement, with his blood on it. You're an engineer, you'd know how to use such a tool, and you'd wear gloves to avoid prints. Why were you in the garden, by the basement window? Were you watching Mr. Crane before you entered?" Barlow's face paled, his fingers twitching. "I wasn't in the garden. I went to the front door, like I said. Crane let me in, we talked, and I left. I don't know about any window or cloth." Clara Barlow spoke up, her voice cool. "Inspector, surely you don't think Edward and I were in league? I met Crane separately to offer a deal for Meridian Tech. He refused, and I left by train. My ticket stub proves it. I had no reason to harm him." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Miss Barlow, you were pressing Mr. Crane for his Morse enhancer, as was Mr. Barlow's firm. Did you know of each other's visits? Or perhaps you met in St. Mary Mead, and your interests collided?" Clara's composure faltered, a flicker of unease crossing her face. "I knew of Barlow and Sons. Of course, they're competitors. But I didn't meet Edward there. My visit was business, nothing more." Craddock leaned forward, his notebook open. "Mr. Barlow, your car was seen near the church, not Much Benham. And the grease on your gloves found in your London flat, by the way, matches the smudge. You were in that house, and you struck Crane. Why? Barlow's shoulders slumped, his voice breaking. All right, I was there. But I didn't mean to hurt him, not badly. I went to the Grantham house to pressure him, yes. Our firm's been bleeding money, and Crane's device could have saved us. He was in the parlour, fiddling with that telegraph key, showing off his damn enhancer. I got angry. He laughed at our patent claim, said we'd never get it. I saw the wrench on the table, grabbed it, and I just meant to scare him. He turned, I swung, and he fell. The coffee spilled, and I panicked. I locked the door and left through the front, drove off in the car. I didn't know he'd write that message. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face remained serene. And the basement window, Mr. Barlow, the smudge, the cloth were. You watching him first? Barlow nodded, his voice barely a whisper. I looked through the window earlier to see if he was alone. I tore my coat on a thorn, didn't realize. I went in later, through the front, when he let me in. Craddock's eyes gleamed with triumph. And the gloves, you wore them too. Avoid prints, didn't you? Yes, Barlow admitted, his head bowing. I didn't plan to hurt him, I swear. I just wanted the plans. When he fell, I thought he was dead. I locked the door to buy time, dumped the coat in London. Miss Marple turned to Clara, and you, Miss Barlow, did you know of Edward's intentions? Clara shook her head, her voice firm. No. I wanted the device for Meridian, but I'm no criminal. My offer was fair, and when Crane refused, I left. I had no part in this. Miss Marple studied her, noting the steadiness of her gaze. Clara's alibi held, and her role seemed limited to a failed negotiation. The coffee's tail, the wrench, the greasel pointed to Edward Barlow alone. She recalled a village theft years ago, when a carpenter's apprentice had struck his master in a fit of rage, leaving a mark on a workbench that betrayed him. Barlow's confession, spurred by the weight of evidence, was the final stitch in the pattern. Craddock signalled for a constable to take Barlow into custody, then turned to Miss Marple. You were right about the coffee, Miss Marple. It led us straight to him. She smiled faintly. It was Mr. Crane's voice, Inspector. He spoke when he could not, and we only had to listen. Later that day, Miss Marple visited Mr. Crane in Much Benham's hospital, where he was slowly recovering. His room was bright with afternoon light, and his eyes, though tired, held a spark of relief. Miss Marple, he said, his voice stronger now, they tell me you found the man who did this. Edward Barlow, from Barlow and Sons. Yes, she said, settling beside him. He wanted your Morse enhancer, and when you refused, he acted in desperation. The coffee you spilled it told us everything. Crane's lips twitched in a faint smile. I remember falling, the cup breaking. I knew I was hurt, and I thought, if I could leave a sign, someone might see it. The coffee was all I had. You did well, Miss Marple said, patting his hand. Your message was clear, and it led us to the truth. As she left the hospital, the village was settling into its evening hush, the mist rising from the meadows. Miss Marple walked back to Danemead Cottage, her step light but thoughtful. The Grantham house, with its false signal and true plea, had yielded its secrets. The radiator's clanging had misled the neighbours, but the coffee had spoken plainly, guiding her to Edward Barlow's guilt. She thought of St. Mary Mead's quiet rhythms, how they concealed human passions, greed, ambition, fear. The mystery was solved, but its echoes lingered. A reminder that even in a village, The smallest acts could reveal the deepest truths. Back in her sitting room, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the needles clicking softly by the fire. She smiled to herself, thinking of Mr. Crane's recovery and the village's return to peace. People, she murmured, always leave something behind, even in a cup of coffee.